Hi, Eric and Brenna here.
And in this video, we'll look at some of the most common fraction and decimal pairs.
So we'll have 4 different groups of fractions that we'll consider. And those 4 groups are the halves, for example, 1/2, and the quarters. And the quarters are also called the fourths, and having those 2 names for the fraction will help us as we look at the fraction and decimal equivalent pairs. And for example, 1/4 is a fraction in that category. And we'll look at the tenths, for example, 1/10. And finally, we'll look at the thirds, for example, 1/3. So there's our 4 categories, and Brenna will start us off with a look at the halves.
Okay, well let's get started with the fraction 1/2. And you can absolutely read this as 1/2. But the more common way of referring to this fraction would simply be 1/2. And to understand what this quantity means, it can help to draw a picture. For example, I'm going to draw a circle to represent one whole, as in the whole thing, and I'm going to split it into 2 pieces. And then I'm going to shade just one of those 2 pieces. And so how does this picture relate to our fraction? Well, the denominator, 2, tells us we have 2 equal-sized pieces, and 1 is the number of pieces that is shaded or selected. So we have 1 out of 2 equal-sized pieces, or 1/2. So what if we want to consider the decimal version? Well, it helps to think of our whole being $1. Well, what is half of a dollar? That would be 50 cents. But it turns out the 0 after the 5 is optional. You could just write this as 0.5. Either way, we can see that the fraction 1/2 is equal to 0.5 as a decimal. Okay, well, what if I now shaded in the second half of this picture? Now we have still 2 equal-sized pieces, but now I've shaded or selected 2 out of those 2 pieces. So what would that be? Well, now we're looking at the whole thing, or just 1. So therefore, 2/2 is equal to 1. And that's the story for the halves.
Thank you, Brenna. And now that Brenna has taken us through the halves, we can start with the quarters, starting with 1/4, and then 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. So to represent these quarters, we'll draw one whole. And I'll draw this square to represent one whole. And since we're doing fourths or quarters, we'll divide that one whole into 4 equal pieces. And so this 1/4 is 1/4, or 1/4. And in this picture, this is represented by, well, since we have 4 equal pieces, then we want to select or shade one of those. So we'll shade in one of these 4 equal pieces. And so that's how we represent 1/4. And then we could fill in the rest of the names. So now we have the labels for all of these: 2/4, 2/4, 3/4, 3/4, 4/4, or 4/4. And so next let's talk about how we turn these into decimals. Well, so 1/4 or 1/4, it's nice to have the name 1/4 there because that helps us think about this in terms of money. So if that one whole was $1, well then 1/4 is 25 cents. Or we would say that 1/4 is 0.25. And with the 2/4, so now we'll shade in our next one, and 2/4 is 2/4. 2/4 is 50 cents. And as Brenda pointed out earlier, 50 cents could also be represented by 0.5. And looking back at our picture, we see that we have half of that picture shaded, so we see that 2/4 is 1/2. Moving on to 3/4. Well, thinking back to money, if you have 3/4, you have 75 cents, so 3/4 is 0.75. And over on our picture, 3/4 looks like 3 out of our pieces selected. And finally, with 4/4 or 4/4, well, if you had 4/4, you'd have $1, and you can also see that on our picture, because 4/4 would mean that we now have that entire whole shaded in, and an entire whole is 1. And so next, Brenna will walk us through the tenths.
Okay, and now for the tenths. First, we'll look at 1/10, or simply 1/10. And in my picture, I've got a rectangle for one whole divided into 10 equal pieces. I am going to shade 1 out of those 10 pieces to represent 1/10. Now for the decimal form, it helps again to think of money. What's a tenth of a dollar? Well, that would be a dime, or 10 cents, or simply 0.1. Okay, and for the rest of our examples, and to see a pattern, it can be really helpful for us to know that the first digit after the decimal point is called the tenths place. So that digit, this 1, is telling us that we have 1/10. Okay, so if we wanted to try the next one, how about 2/10? And then I can go back over to my picture and shade the second out of the 10 pieces. And we can think of money, 2 dimes would be 20 cents, or we can use the fact that we now know the first digit after the decimal point counts how many tenths we have. So in this case, hey, we have 2/10, so that would be a 2 in the tenths place, or 0.2. We may get a sense of how this pattern is working now. Let's try it for 3/10. Now I've got 3 out of the 10 pieces shaded, so as a decimal point, that is going to be a 3 in my tenths place, or 0.3. Okay, let's skip ahead a little bit until we get just before we reach 1/2. We will have 9/10. I'll put a ... here to say this pattern does continue as we would expect. How about 9/10? Okay, I've got 9/10 shaded, and that would be equal to 0.9. And then finally, if I shade in that last tenth, we've got 10 out of the 10 pieces, or more simply 1, for 1 whole, the entire thing. And there we have the tenths.
For our last fraction grouping, we'll look at the thirds.
But unlike the previous examples, we won't use money because we don't really cut up our money into thirds of a dollar.
Right, there's no coins that are for 1/3 of a dollar. But we do see thirds in a lot of places in real life. For example, when we're talking about time.
A third of an hour is 20 minutes.
Or we could be talking about distance, and we'd see thirds.
A third of a yard is 1 foot.
Or, for example, we might see them in baking.
A third of a tablespoon is a teaspoon.
In the thirds grouping, we'll start with the fraction 1/3. And you can see that on the side here, we have our 1 whole cut into 3 equal pieces. So for 1/3, we'll shade 1 of those 3 equal pieces to represent this as a picture. And as a decimal, if we put that into a calculator, we'll see that we get 0.3333, and this will repeat. This will fill up your entire calculator screen. And so to show that these 3's keep repeating, we'll put this ... or these ellipses at the end. And that way we're showing the exact answer for 1/3 as a decimal. Another more compact way that we could show this exact answer as a decimal is with 0.3 as a bar over the 3, and that bar means that this 1, 3 is going to repeat infinitely. So there again we have an exact representation of 1/3 as a decimal. Or we could round, and when we round we don't have an exact answer anymore, so we use these squiggly equal signs, and if we rounded to say 3 decimal places, then we would get 0.333. And the next fractions in the thirds are 2/3 and 3/3. So with 2/3, back over here we have our 1 whole in 3 equal pieces, and so now with 2/3 we'll need our second piece. And so we'll fill that in, and we can see that, well, looking back at our first representation, we had 1/3 was 0.3 repeating. And the picture shows that we have twice as many thirds now. So to turn 2/3 into a decimal, we can multiply this by 2. And so that will give us 0.666 repeating. So again, we'll use these ellipses to show that this repeats. Or now it's the number 6 that's repeating, so we could say 0.6 with a bar. And again, that bar over the 6 means that that's the digit that repeats infinitely, just like we can see happening in the line above with the ellipses. Or our third option is we could round. And rounding, we know, means that it's not exact, so we'll use the squiggly equal sign, or the approximately equals. And we could round to, say, 3 digits again. And so that would start off with 0.66, and then we have to be careful with the next digit because we'd have a 6 after that, but then our fourth digit would also be a 6, which would cause the third digit to round to a 7. And finally, we have 3/3. So 3/3 would be, we'd shade in this last 1/3 piece. So now we have the entire whole, and 1 whole is represented by 1.
Thank you so much for watching. We hope this video was helpful.
Keep calm and math on.